All right, everybody. Hi, we are live. Welcome to today's Chacruna Community Forum. My name is Josh Meadow. I'm the Director of Events and Community for Chacruna. I'm seeing people are already posting in the chat where they're calling in from. Feel free to continue doing that and share where you're located. See, we have UK, Vermont, Indiana, New York, Canada, Berlin. It's always wonderful how international these events have become. So we're really excited for today's event. I'm just going to give a little introduction to this platform, Crowdcast. And then I'm going to bring on Bia Labate, our Executive Director, to share a little more about Chacruna before introducing today's guest speakers, Rick Doblin and Natalie Ginsberg. So if you haven't used this platform, the way it works is pretty simple. You can post in the chat and comment and share about your thoughts about the content of the event. If you do have a question, the event's going to be about an hour and a half, and the conversation with Rick and Natalie will go until around 1 p.m., and then we'll move into a question and answer period. So if you do have questions, you can post your questions using the Ask a Question feature, which is the button at the bottom of your screen here in Crowdcast. So you can post your questions there, vote up on your favorite questions, and those ones will go to the top, and we'll have the last 30 minutes or so to ask those. This event will be recorded and will be immediately available to rewatch as soon as it's over. So if you miss anything, you can do that. And just one note about the chat. We just want to really encourage people to keep things really civil and respectful and kind and compassionate, and not to attack or be overly aggressive. So we'll be monitoring the chat for that. But please do discuss and share and debate your thoughts around the event. So I think that is all I have to say for now, and I'm going to bring on Bia to share a little bit more.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another community forum of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. And we are a small nonprofit organization. We're incorporated in the state of California, waiting to have our federal status as tax-deductible organization. MAPS is our fiscal sponsor, and I just want to take a moment to thank Rick Doblin and all the wonderful team at MAPS for their support to Chacruna. MAPS has also been sponsored for, I think, maybe 6 or more conferences that we organized throughout the years. So MAPS has been a sister organization supportive of Chacruna, and in many regards, we do work that complement each other, although we have different approaches and different tastes. So Chacruna is an organization that is trying to provide public education about psychedelic plant medicines and making knowledge about psychedelics more accessible, making academic knowledge more palatable and accessible and easy to digest and to learn. Another big part of our mission is to create a bridge between the universe of the ceremonial use of sacred plants, indigenous people, ritual religion, tradition, and the emerging field of psychedelic science. It's also part of Chacruna's mission to promote equity, access, diversity, and inclusion in the field of psychedelic science. And our conferences and our articles and our programs are focused on giving visibility to voices of people of color, of women, of indigenous people, of gay people, queer people, of people from the global south, and also uplifting the voices of social sciences, in particular anthropology, in the field of psychedelic science, because when we talk about healing, we're not talking about a set of physical properties and biochemical principles, but we're also talking about context, relationships, how healing has to do with a global aspect and not just a particular effect by a molecule. And it's really our pleasure to have this session today, which aims to discuss some critical points about the mainstreaming or commodification or both of psychedelics, the big rush of all these new businesses coming into our scene and coming to our space, and the new players and all the millions of dollars that are arriving, and MAPS crucial role in mainstreaming psychedelics. And we want to bring some critical reflections on these aspects, as well as the relationship with the military. So some people have expressed discontent about cooperating with the military, and others feel that that's an important way to mainstream psychedelics. I'm not going to tell you all about it, because I'm going to hand it over to my amazing friend and colleague, Natalie Ginsberg. So I just want to, finish my presentation with my gratitude to MAPS as a sister organization that has been doing a lot of work, and my gratitude for the voluntary participation of Rick and Natalie, who are not earning any honorarium and are supporting Chacruna's educational mission. And we're open to creating this sensitive conversation that touches on critical points, but with a Chacruna flavor, involving elegance and, good taste and cordiality and friendship and fun, and just critical thinking, trying to go a little bit ahead of the curve. We like to pride ourselves to always try to be a little bit ahead of the curve, and having initiated conversations that are fundamental and that have been influencing the zeitgeist of the psychedelic community. I am based in San Francisco. The sky is smoky and we are under fires, and there's a global pandemic and so much tension and so much pain throughout the world. I send everybody my deepest solidarity and much love from me and the Chacruna team. Thank you.
Great.
Hi. Thank you so much, Bia, for inviting us and giving me the opportunity to ask some questions of Rick, who a man I've been really lucky to work with for the past 6 years. And I'm calling in myself from Vermont. I saw some Vermonters in the chat, which made me happy. And it's on Abenaki land. It was cool to see so many people calling in from all over the world. I'd love to see if some of you know maybe the indigenous land that the city that you're in is also located on. It would be cool to share that in the chat as well. And I guess I just want to dive in, because we have so much to get to today and to discuss. But to start, as Bia alluded to, it really hasn't been the easiest past few weeks for so many of us, living through fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods on top of the pandemic. And Rick, I know you also had a particularly difficult end of your summer with the passing of your second parent and an emergency surgery. So to start, I'm curious if you could share a bit about what you've learned and how your persistent and admirable optimism may have been impacted by these last few months.
Well, what I've learned is that, my mom just died at 91 at home in bed with my brother and sister nearby. And then I decided to get on a plane for the first time in 5.5 months to go home to the funeral. And the day after the funeral, I started feeling this pain, and then I went to the hospital and I needed emergency removal of my gallbladder. I learned how absolutely miraculous modern surgery is. It was laparoscopic surgery, 4 little holes. It used to be they had to cut open your muscles and take up your rib cage, and it was months to recuperate. This was just, I wasn't even in pain the next day. It was astonishing. But what I was able to do was to recuperate for the first week. I'm still recuperating. I think I'm still in a little pain right now, actually, in my digestion, but it'll take a couple months to fully come back to normal. But I was able to stay in my house where I grew up, my childhood house, where my father died in the den 1.5 years ago. My mother died in bed a couple weeks ago. And I was just confronting my own mortality. And just to be in that space. And not only that, it was this beautiful house designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright's. It was a very unusual place to grow up in that influenced me a lot. And now it looks like some of the neighbors, none of our siblings, me or my siblings, want to live there. So we're going to sell it. It looks like the neighbors might want to buy it to tear it down. So I got this real sense of the transitory nature of our lives, and that we're, not here for that long, actually. And so what it ended up doing was really building in me this great sense of gratitude for being able to work with the whole MAPS team now, and to have been able to work on my own for some of the time, but basically my whole life since I was 18, to try to focus on how to bring back psychedelics. And so, I learned the importance of having a life with purpose and meaning, and how ennobling that can be. I also felt pretty recently, but certainly that time when I was really sick right after the operation, that the MAPS operation, the MAPS staff is so good and so varied now that things were going to continue even without me. Michael Midhofer and I had this. Michael is our lead psychiatrist, works for 20 years, and we had a discussion after I was doing a little bit better, just about a week and a half ago. But it was with a group at Harvard, at MGH, Massachusetts General Hospital, where they're finally going to do MDMA research with veterans with PTSD and bring them into like a several week inpatient kind of program with yoga and all these other different kind of things. And there's a group that's in the Netherlands, in Leiden, Eric Vermetten, who is actually the chief mental health person for the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and also a world expert in PTSD. So they're going to do something somewhat similar. And so after the meeting, Michael and I were like, wow, this really has gotten started enough that Michael's now got a bunch of grandkids. And so he's spending more time with his grandkids. And he was saying that he feels good about that, because he feels like the baton is being handed to a new generation of leaders and people. And so I guess the main thing I learned is, first off, I don't feel my parents are really gone. They are in that way, but the influence that they've had, and the love that they've shared with me, and the freedoms that they've given me, and the support that they've given me, and the ideas that I really think about, and how I'm organized, I just feel very much their presence. And I also really just feel like the ability that I had to focus outward. Once I was so still recovering, and I'm still just a little bit, I've been a bit more weak. It's that the privilege, that those who are privileged have the opportunity and the obligation to work for social change and to work on social justice. That those people that are oppressed are often really too struggling for survival, and don't necessarily have the energy or the connections or the resources, to really do work for social justice. Now, of course, they can do things, and they can vote, and and everybody needs to do things like that. But I just really learned even more so how lucky I've been. This was the first operation. I just turned, I'm about to turn 67 in a couple months. So it was the first operation of my life, but just how grateful I am to have more time to continue to work. I really like to see FDA and EMA and around the world make MDMA into a medicine. So, my eternal optimism is still there, and I'd say even more. But it felt really good to be stuck in bed and not able to even think much for a couple of days, and know that MAPS was just rolling on.
Well, along those lines, actually, when are we expecting MDMA to be approved by the FDA? And has COVID impacted the timeline at all?
Oh, well, COVID is the big disruptor, of course. We had the interim analysis in March from our first of 2 phase 3 studies. And then the interim analysis results couldn't be better. We had a 90% or greater chance of obtaining statistical significance with at least a medium effect size. But that's when the COVID really hit, the lockdown happened. And so FDA reached out to us and to many other researchers, and they offered us the opportunity to end the study early if we wanted to, which is a bit risky because the more numbers you have in the study, the more likely you are to get statistical significance. So we came to agreement with FDA that we would end with 90 subjects instead of 100. And that happened in August. And so we will have the data analysis, the data lock, data cleansing. By around October 22nd, we'll know if the first study was statistically significant. Now, if it was, we are now starting up our second phase 3 study. We've got about 5 or 6 sites of the 14 sites open. The rest are going to be opening hopefully over the next several months and into early 2021. So we expect that sometime around the middle of 2022, we'll be done with all of the required studies. And then we will submit the data to FDA, and it'll be the end of 2022 or early 2023 that we anticipate, if the data comes along fine, if we don't have any unusual safety problems. There was one person in the first study who attempted suicide during the study. And it turned out that they were in the control group. So I think our safety is...
To clarify for people not familiar with research, that means they did not receive any MDMA.
Right, yeah, they received the therapy without MDMA. And actually, it's very hard to do a double-blind study with psychedelics. And this person came to the conclusion that they did get the placebo, and they didn't know that they could wait until a year or so till she could volunteer for the crossover to take therapy with MDMA at no cost. But I'm thinking that it'll be, end of 2022, early 2023. Now in Europe, we're just starting the research in 7 different countries. We're not approved fully in all these 7 countries, but we're doing studies there that would be for the training of the therapist. The last part of our training of therapists is to supervise them as they work with actual PTSD patients, and we can only do that in the context of a protocol. So we think that we'll be able to start most of those studies over the next 3-4 months. The Czech Republic has just gone on lockdown for the research has been shut down. Israel's just gone on a 3-week lockdown. So COVID is having a big impact. And the challenge for us also is that every month's delay costs us in the neighborhood of $140,000 because we have staff that are, on staff. We're paying for rent at a lot of private practice sites. So it's been both costly in time and money. But the flip side of that is that I say the whole world is now more sensitized to the need to treat trauma and mental illness. The levels of stress and trauma have risen so much, particularly in underprivileged, under-resourced communities, that there's been a lot more sensitivity to the need to develop new treatments, and particularly treatments that are effective and that don't necessarily require, daily medication for years at a time. So overall, I think it's been a problem, but we're dealing with it as best we can. So I think approval in Europe will be 6 months or so after approval in the U.S. Approval in Israel and Canada will also be several months after the approval in the U.S. because I think both Canada, Health Canada, and Israeli Ministry of Health want the FDA to go first because they are the premier agency for reviewing drug development. Now we're starting to train people in Somaliland, Kenya, South Africa. We've already trained people in Brazil. We're really moving forward to try to globalize, but we're going to have a massive financial, we've just succeeded massively to raise $30 million, but we're going to need to raise another $30 million to go to EMA and globalize. So that's going to be a challenge. We'll start that in November, probably.
Well, then along that line of challenge, why did you choose to go the nonprofit drug development route? And what is a public benefit corporation for those listeners who aren't familiar with the math model?
Well, the reason I was laughing is because, now that there's for-profit companies that are being started up right and left, it seems like a choice. Why did you go nonprofit instead of for-profit? But 34 years ago, in 1986, when I started MAPS, when psychedelic research was completely shut down, we had no idea when it would open up again. The idea of trying to get investor money was ridiculous. I mean, it was impossible. And at the same time, what was also impossible was money from the National Institute of Mental Health, or government money, or major foundation money. So the reason I started as a nonprofit is because that was the only way. And it's been the only way, I would say, for 31 of the 34 years of MAPS.
But now, a few years ago, you did choose to go the public benefit route when you could have gone of the more traditional for-profit route.
Yeah. So the reason so let me just say, so it was April of 1986 that I started MAPS as a nonprofit. It was December 2014 that we started the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. Now, when I started MAPS, no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit. But there was something that Ronald Reagan did in 1984 that I completely missed, which was he signed a law to create incentives for developing drugs that were off patent. Now, when I studied at the Kennedy School and got my master's, and then I took a class at Harvard Law School in food and drug regulation from the nation's foremost expert who wrote the textbook, I also never figured it out. That was in the mid-90s, and he didn't teach that, because pharma doesn't develop drugs that are off patent. So this was like an obscure thing. So I actually learned about it around 2013, which was a shocking thing. So that what it means is that if you make a drug into a medicine that's off patent, and MDMA was invented by Merck in 1912. And then in the early 90s, I hired patent attorneys to develop anti-patent strategies so nobody could patent the uses of MDMA. I just thought that was the best for public benefit. But this was...
And maybe could you say a word about what that strategy is so other people are familiar with the anti-patent strategy?
Yeah. So, I think most people have probably heard of Ibogaine, which is really good for opiate addiction, for other things. It's a very powerful drug from Western Africa. So in 86, when I started MAPS, another company called NDA, New Drug Application, NDA International, Howard Lotsoff, started it as a for-profit company to develop Ibogaine into a medicine. He never raised the money he needed. Nothing ever happened. But what did happen, the early few studies that he started, he ran out of money with the first one. And then Deborah Mash, who was doing it, had to put up her own money for it. And then she discovered the long-lasting metabolite for Ibogaine, noribogaine. She wanted to patent it. Howard said no, he owned it. She said no, I paid for some of the study. And anyway, they started suing each other. So the whole thing just went downhill with all sorts of people suing each other, and they couldn't raise the money. So I contacted their patent attorney, and I said, this is, destroyed Ibogaine. Now Ibogaine, those patents are all expired. So it's possible to work again in the public domain for Ibogaine for opiate addiction. But the patent attorneys said that you can only patent an original idea. So what we do is for any new use of MDMA that we think of or that anybody reports, we put stories on our website about that, or we make it public. So for example, Andy Weil referred me to a patient who claimed that they took MDMA and their rheumatoid arthritis went away. Now, one of the most unexplored areas of MDMA and also other psychedelics actually is the mind-body connection. What these drugs can do for physical, what we consider to be physical illnesses that may have, some emotional component. So what I did is we got that person to write the story about MDMA curing her of rheumatoid arthritis. We put it up on our website. Now nobody can say that they can patent the idea of MDMA for rheumatoid arthritis. So we've done that with a whole different range of things. We're even done it now for MDMA for postpartum depression and MDMA, eating disorders and all things like that. So it was actually then in 2013 that I learned, though, that this data exclusivity, what it means is that if you make a drug into a medicine, the FDA automatically will say that for 5 years, no one can use your data to market a generic. And if you do pediatric studies, which means studies in initially 12 to 17-year-olds, which the FDA is requiring most sponsors to do now if you succeed in adults, then you get an extra 6 months. It blocks a generic manufacturer from even applying till this 5.5 years is over. It takes FDA at least 6 months to review. So basically it'd be 6 years data exclusivity. In EMA Europe, it's 10 years. So then I realized that we could actually make money selling MDMA. And that one of the important things that we could say to our donors is that we're asking you for lots and lots of money. You know, we just added it up, and we've raised over $100 million in the history of MAPS since the donations and multi-year pledges, which is an astonishing amount of money for donors to just give away. And so what I could say to donors is that we might be able to become a sustainable nonprofit through the sale of MDMA by prescription, but I don't want to do it in the classic for-profit way where you maximize profits. So from those people that are watching from around the world, where national health care is more accepted, you know, what's so shocking, I'd say about where we're at here is that the average healthcare expenditures are more expensive here than in anywhere else in the world, but our outcomes are like 40 or 50 among the countries. So the profit motive has warped healthcare out of all recognition. And I think healthcare should be more of a right, a national healthcare services. So we wanted to not just demonstrate new approaches to mental health, meaning psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, but we wanted to develop new ways to market prescription drugs. And so the Public Benefit Corporation is a modification of capitalism. You could say that capitalism, with profit over everything else, you push off the external costs onto the public domain. It's growth at all costs. It's kind of like a cancer that can destroy the host. So I think there's a lot of valid criticisms about capitalism, although it does drive innovation. It's really good in some ways. But I think the Benefit Corporation is a modification of capitalism where you still make profit, but what comes first is public benefit. So that's why we created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation as our for-profit arm. And the way we did it, though, is that it has only one investor, which is the nonprofit. So we have a nonprofit that owns the for-profit Public Benefit Corporation, and we've got about 100 people now, which, again, is kind of astonishing. And around 2/3 of them work at the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, and 1/3 work at MAPS, doing the fundraising, the communications, the policy and advocacy, which is you're doing, Natalie, and a lot of other functions. And so I think that I'm really proud of the Public Benefit Corporation, the way that we've set that up. And because it's all entirely owned by the nonprofit, whatever profits are made go back to the mission of the nonprofit.
I'm also really proud to work at a public benefit or at an organization that owns a public benefit corporation, and to employ this anti-patent strategy and have this mindset of working for the greater good. But as you know, the most for-profit traditional drug development companies, even in the psychedelic space, one of their primary ways of making money is developing patents. So I'm curious, how does MAPS engage, and what kind of relationships do we have with some of these main for-profit psychedelic companies in the space, including some of the biggest names like Compass and Atai, which are of course connected? And what are the difficulties of nonprofit for-profit collaboration, especially with Atai's recent announcement of developing an MDMA-inspired drug?
Yeah, and then also Compass announcing that they're going to put out an IPO soon. And I'd be very curious to see what they value their company at. But my guess is that they will value their company, I don't know, somewhere like $400 or $500 million or something, maybe even more. And we're ahead of them in terms of drug development. But I like to think about maps like a public utility, like, the water company or the electric company in some ways, or a dam, but we're a public utility for psychedelics. So our view is that we share all the information that we get with the public, which means both profit and for-profit companies. So I'm not against for-profit companies. People need to make a living, they need to make profits, but we think that the nonprofit maps, and hopefully the nonprofit USONA, which is working on psilocybin, will keep the for-profits in check to some degree about what they can charge and how they operate. And we can also learn from them about some of the things that they're working on with regulatory approvals. Compass is doing a lot with wearable technologies. We'll learn about that. So Atai just recently announced that they've started a company called Empath Bio, which is to develop MDMA-like drugs. And they were a little bit worried I would be upset. They were competitive. And so that they sent me an email before they made the public announcement. And my reaction was great. I'm not upset at all. This idea of, if you can improve patient outcomes, if you can develop, better drugs than MDMA, go for it. We're opening the door, and we welcome improvements, because really, again, we're about public benefit. So I think, though, I did an interview recently where Empath Bio, they were saying that we're doing MDMA 1.0 and they want to do MDMA 2.0, and that they want to make it so that it's not so difficult to scale. And what they're basically saying is that they want to do it, come in for a few hours, maybe you don't have much psychotherapy, maybe you even make a drug that people can take on their own at home or somehow or other. So so what I said to the interviewer is, it sounds to me like it's MDMA 0.5 in terms of the outcomes that they're likely to get, because we work with the hardest patients. So I'm very supportive of that. Now, with Ibogaine, there's been a lot of developments with Ibogaine recently, and Atai has another company that they bought all these patents from Deborah Mash that she had, and they want to develop Ibogaine into a medicine. So I spoke to Christian Angermeyer, who's actually funding a project of yours on the of Natalie's that she's working on with others, with Robin Card Harris and Leo Roseman, and others on the Israeli Palestinians doing ayahuasca and MDMA together. So we were at the World Economic Forum. Christian had a big dinner. He invited me to that to speak about what MAPS was doing. And then he announced that they had bought all these patents and were going into Ibogaine. And I said, wow, we've been working on Ibogaine for a long time as well. So, what are we going to do? So at first I thought, should I just give it up, let them do it? And then I thought, no, I don't think so. We don't have the resources for it, but we have the resources for the next step, which is a pre-IND meeting with FDA to talk about whether they would permit a safety study with Ibogaine to go forward. And the first step of that is an investigator's brochure, meaning a survey of the world's literature. And so Christian said that they're planning to go with Health Canada first, and they have some unpublished data that they might be willing to share with us to improve our discussions with FDA. So once we complete this investigator's brochure, which I think will be in the next month or two, we're going to show it to Atai, and they will decide whether they want to share with us their unpublished data to add to our package for this pre-IND meeting with FDA. So it's a win-win situation. If FDA says yes, then, and we share all of this with the public, with other groups, not just with Atai. So Atai is not asking for exclusive information that we share only with them. And then I just heard that there's going to be a substantial donation has been made to Imperial College, to David Nutt and Robin Card Harris, to do a safety study with Ibogaine, which they're also, I believe, going to put in the public domain. So Ibogaine is moving forward. And so I think what this means for us in terms of collaboration is that we will collaborate, but there are certain conditions. We want things to be made public. We don't want what we do together to be patented, because we're going to own the data in a sense, or the communication. So It's really about collaborating in certain ways. Now, you talked about patents. Let me just say that, Compass has tried to patent the production process of the psilocybin. USONA just made public their production process for psilocybin. And so we're going to do the same. I mean, we're going to take the knowledge that we get, which is intellectual property, about producing MDMA at commercial scale, and then putting it in capsules, also, again, at our commercial scale. And we're going to just make all that public.
Able to do the same for ibogaine, or is that?
Well, we're not going to be the ones initially that manufacture the ibogaine. So we may get it from others. We're not sure. We don't need to have a source of ibogaine to have this pre-IND meeting with FDA, because it's really about, we need to have the summary of the world's literature and then a protocol of a safety study. And then we submit that to FDA. And then if they say yes, it'll be a $2.5 million study, which we don't have the money for yet. But maybe, I'm not sure what Robin and David Nutt are going to be doing with their study, how much they're being donated. So we'll see what's next. But I think that if we can just open up the FDA to say, yeah, they will permit ibogaine research, which they have in the past for Deborah Mash and Howard Lotsoff. So I think we will collaborate where we can, subject to making things in the public domain.
Cool. And it sounds like the more nonprofit entities and academic studies are conducted and put in the public domain, that hopefully can serve as a balance to those trying to patent and not share the information.
Yeah, but I guess I should say that when people do develop new knowledge, I'm not opposed to them patenting it. It's overbroad patents that's the problem. When patents are used as a business weapon to try to block other people from doing things, that's not good. And so, and usually it fails anyway, because it's challenged.
Cool. You've talked a very long time, since I've known you, about your goal of mainstreaming psychedelic medicine and psychedelic culture. But what do you see as some of the potential dangers of bringing psychedelics mainstream? Like, for example, what do you think about the new pandemic policies that allow ketamine therapy to be administered at home via telemedicine without any supervision?
Well, I don't think it's without any supervision. It's with telemedicine is supervision, but there's nobody there. And the Spravato, which is what everybody's talking about, because you don't give people a loaded syringe and have them inject IM at home on their own. You're on mute. There, now we can hear you.
I was going to say, I believe there are also lozenges available at home, so not only the nasal spray.
Yes, I think so. So I think those are generally milder than certainly than IM or IV. I think people are suffering, and we need to recognize that under pandemic conditions, certain things can be done telemedicine. Even in our own studies, we have done a lot of the preparation sessions and integration sessions through telemedicine. But we think that the actual MDMA sessions need to be done in person. And I think particularly when you work with people that are very severely depressed or with PTSD, if it was like a psilocybin session for depression, I don't think that should be done remotely. On the other hand, for the 75th anniversary of, 77th anniversary of LSD, which was this year, we tried remote Zendo, remote psychedelic harm reduction. So a bunch of people who had difficult trips to celebrate the 77th anniversary of LSD were able to call out at any one time on the webinar, the site, to ask for somebody to sit with them. And we actually found that worked fairly well. Now, people were needing help. It wasn't a therapy setting. But the pandemic it'll just go away. No, as our president has said, it will eventually, presumably, hopefully with vaccines or whatever, we'll be able to resume a lot more of inpatient therapy. And so I think what I'm concerned about. So your question though is really what about means? What are the risks of mainstreaming psychedelics? And it's not just about the pandemic and trying to have, telemedicine rather than in person. So I think that there are a bunch of risks. What you're worried about is for-profit companies or others, even from nonprofits. If the therapists are not properly trained, of having a lot of bad outcomes, and if that happens, that could result in the shifts in public opinion against this, or FDA or regulatory agencies saying that there's more difficult adverse events, and now they have to reevaluate the approvals. Now, what we're also involved in and support, and this is what I mean by mainstreaming, is not just medicalization, it's legalization. And so we're talking about licensed legalization. And David Bronner, who's on our board of directors, and others are that are very much affiliated with MAPS, are deeply involved in fundraising for the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, which is going to be on the ballot. About almost $5 million has been raised for this initiative to try to create like a state system for guides for psilocybin that will be not just for patients, but for otherwise people without a psychiatric diagnosis to experience psilocybin in these sort of controlled ways. So we're concerned about also Denver, which said mushrooms are the lowest enforcement priority, or Oakland as well. All the people going to the Netherlands, for mushroom truffles. It's going pretty well there, but what we're very appreciative of is those groups that like Alalajo and others that are very much caring about the experiences that people have, so that they avoid or try to minimize, problem use. So while we have this one medical track, and then we also want to see drug policy reform, the concern is that, first off, I'd say people get impure drugs. And so we got to really start doing drug checking. The concern is that people have lots and lots of misinformation. They don't really have honest drug education in schools. And we're also concerned that there's not a lot of support services. So Sarah Gale, who is the head of the Zendo, or is recently moving out of being the head of the Zendo project, but was so much, she's on the city council committee in Denver about the implementation of mushrooms as the lowest enforcement priority. So she's working to train the police, train the doctors, train the emergency rooms, hospitals about de-escalating psychedelic crises and trying to turn them in a productive way. So my concern is that, negative outcomes will happen. But I also think there are so many negative outcomes from prohibition that they outweigh the negative outcome. But the public might not see that. So the early stages of rolling things out, we have to be especially careful. And so that's my concern, that maybe the profit motive will drive people to be irresponsible, or just the policies will move forward, but the policies of access will move forward, but not the policies of harm reduction. I guess I should say that I think the mainstreaming of psychedelics is essential for humanity to, well, I don't want to say essential, but I would say potentially essential. Mankind, humankind, womankind, we're in a collision course with the planet. Whether we're going to survive is not clear. The power of the irrational, the power of our weapons, the power of our denial, climate change denial, the power of authoritarian dictators. It's just unclear whether we're going to make it through the next 50 years or 100 years without destroying ourselves, or 200 years with climate change. So I think that what we are wanting to do is to try to balance people out, to spiritualize people, help them feel connected to everything, help them understand our intimate connection with nature, help them resolve their traumas so they don't carry these hatreds down the generations, where we have fights between Sunni and Shiite Muslims since 1600, or 600, I mean, something like that, or between African Americans and white Americans. So anyway, I think that we need the mainstreaming, and the risks are worth taking, but we have to guard against the risks and do what we can so that it's a successful launch, both medicalization and drug policy reform.
Thank you for that. And I guess we have this working to balance and work with people, all different people across spectrums, a kind of consistent feedback, or some people have a critique of MAPS, of our ongoing work with veterans. People critique us for our work with police officers, though it's worth saying that we've actually only had one police officer in all of our studies, and that MAPS is working in some ways to potentially collaborate with potentially work with currently enrolled members of the military. Can you speak a bit to this seeming paradox of working to heal trauma, but simultaneously seeking to work with systems that create so much trauma? And kind of along those lines, can you speak a bit about define moral injury for us and the role that it plays in PTSD for veterans, and how might that impact currently enrolled members of the military differently than veterans?
All right. So first off, I don't see the paradox. I think that the systems that we have, even let's say the police systems, I believe there's systemic racism involved in the drug war and in our American policing. But there's a story. There's a story that some of you may have heard, but it's about how this one person is sitting by a river, and he's noticing all these babies that are floating by, that are floundering, and he goes in and he rescues this one baby, and then he sees another baby, and he goes in and rescues this other baby, and then there's another baby, and he goes in and rescues that baby. And then somebody comes up to him and says, why don't you go upstream and figure out who's throwing all these babies in? So what that means is you got to work with the perpetrators, not just with the victims. Not to say that all police are perpetrators, or that all the military is a perpetrator. We need the military. If there weren't a military, the Nazis would have won the World War II, and you and I would probably not be here. So we need a military, and the military itself is under civilian control, unlike in most or many countries. Luckily, in a lot of the Western countries, the military is under civilian control. It's not like we have a military leadership. So when you blame the soldiers for doing things that you think are immoral, the blame is really primarily due to the politicians, to the people who send them in those missions. There is something noble about saying, I'm going to put my life at risk to save my community from outside threats. So I don't see the paradox. I think that we need to heal people wherever they are. Healing for all is one of our principles. We do have a police officer who's a full-time psychotherapist going through our training program to give MDMA to other police officers with PTSD. So I think that if you heal PTSD in the military and in the police, my view is that they will be less racist, less aggressive, more considerate of the emotional consequences of what they're doing. Moral injury is a term that's used for soldiers who have lost the sense that the war they're fighting is being fought for good reasons. That they have it doesn't seem to make sense. The war in Iraq was a mistaken war that America engaged in. War in Vietnam, we never should have engaged in. And so a lot of the soldiers in these wars feel that not only are they traumatized by the death and destruction that they see around them and the injuries that they and their fellow soldiers are suffering from, injuries and death, but the whole purpose of it doesn't have any meaning to them. It doesn't strike. So that's where it's moral injury, which makes PTSD even worse. And so I think that for those people that want to criticize us for trying to heal people in the military, I think that, when you think about we're all one, well, we're all one. We need to heal people who are suffering everywhere. And I think this idea that you heal people in the military and then they go out and so somebody commits a war crime, then they go out and they get MDMA therapy. Now they feel fine. Somehow ecstasy, magically heals them. And then they go out and commit war crimes. And then they come back for another treatment. And then they commit war crimes. There was actually one Israeli that we worked with that had PTSD from a bunch of his fellow soldiers being murdered in their sleeping bags by an infiltrator. Then it turned out that he actually talked about how helpless that made him feel and how much that contributed to his PTSD. But then it switched to his father when he was young, beating him up, and that's where, and physically abusing him. And that is where the helpless feeling was anchored, so that the other helpless feeling was looked like the real cause of the trauma, but it had deeper roots. But then he was able to share, and this was surprising, that he and his fellow soldiers went on a rampage and killed a bunch of innocent Palestinians. And so they actually did commit war crimes, which he then said, "How now I'm like the Nazis." So we were, so he worked through that. And now what he's doing is he's working with a Palestinian partner in his business. So that's just one story. But what I'm trying to say is that really we need to go where the suffering is. We also need to do politically astute research. So when I first started thinking about MDMA for PTSD as now the main focus for MAPS, we needed a disease that was insufficiently treated by currently available medicines and psychotherapies, that they could work for some, but that there was a large number of people that were treatment resistant. But we also needed sympathetic patients. Psychedelics were demonized, people were scared of them, have been scared of them for decades. And so we really needed a sympathetic patient population. Now, PTSD, about 2/3 of our subjects are women and have PTSD from sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, adult rape and assault, domestic violence. But they don't get the attention in America as the veterans do. Because of our particular militarized culture. And so
and I also offer that it's a bit easier in our culture to talk about trauma from war than trauma from early childhood or from sexual assault. And I might just include some stats I just have pulled up from our phase 3 trials that actually 43% of study participants' primary trauma was sexual assault, which was more than twice as much as the next leading cause, which was 20% had witnessed a death and around 19% had witnessed domestic violence. And overall of phase 3, only 16% of our study participants were veterans, just to get a sense of the statistics we're talking about.
The 16% that were veterans have probably got about 75% of the PR and the media coverage. Now, the other part of mainstreaming is getting the powers that be to accept it. And so I think there's been a lot of wisdom in our... Now, not only that, but the Veterans Administration has developed a lot of treatments for PTSD. So a lot of the experts in PTSD research and treatment are affiliated with the VA. And so by educating them and then educating the powers that be, it's a big step towards mainstreaming. And so I don't see the paradox that you started out by saying. I see just compassion and strategy.
My next question is about the rise of certain conspiracy theories, including QAnon, which we've seen kind of intersect with the New Age and even fringes of psychedelic community. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why QAnon and these kind of conspiracy theories are gaining so much steam, and if people who use psychedelics are particularly vulnerable, or what that intersection might be.
Well, I don't know how much steam QAnon is getting. I know that in the yoga wellness community, there is some concern also in some of the psychedelics, but I would say the people that are going for that are people that have not really done psychedelic therapy. Maybe they've really done psychedelics, but I don't think they've fully processed their own inner shadow. And then you project it out into these fantasy conspiracies. So what I'd like to say is that for those people that are in these communities that are open to this, that open to psychedelics and are starting to believe some of this stuff, that Joe Biden is a pedophile and that there's all these horrible cabals doing things that they consider really doing psychedelic therapy, not just doing psychedelics. And so I don't know that psychedelics necessarily leads to magical thinking, but there is that sort of mystical element, but I'd say that traditional religion has a lot of magical thinking in it too. For example, I'll just share a story from my father, which was that, and you know the story, Natalie, that one of the Israelis, Benny Shannon, is expert in ayahuasca, wrote this great book about ayahuasca experiences. But then he also looked at manna from the Bible, and he said that manna was psychedelic, and Moses was high on psychedelics when he saw the burning bush. And because he was head of psychology at Hebrew University, very well renowned, this paper that he published got international attention, even in the New York Times. And as I went to my dad and said, look, this validates everything I'm doing. Moses was high when he saw the burning bush and stuff. And my dad said, well, in order for me to believe that, first off, I'd have to believe in Moses. And there is no historical record of the Jews building the pyramids or traveling for 40 years in the Sinai desert. I mean, where is all their campsites and all their stuff? And so anyway, traditional religion, I'd say, has more magical thinking than even potentially the psychedelic community. But I think for those people that are flirting with or believing in these conspiracy theories, they need to do more inner work.
Now, I have to say a few words if you're bringing up psychedelics in the Torah stories, and that I was really excited over the last few months to see that they had discovered in an ancient Jewish temple remnants from 800 BC, remnants of cannabis and frankincense being used in an altar. And the word, cannabis is mentioned in the Torah, and there's definitely other references, whether or not the stories in the Torah existed, there's definitely references to using different plant medicines for incense, burning incense, and that God appears after that happens. So that's definitely been interesting for me to be exploring recently. And, I guess along these lines, I'm curious, despite your belief in Moses or in the literal stories of Judaism, how has being Jewish impacted your work?
Fundamentally, it's been absolutely key, because what's been driving me from an early age. So I was born in 1953, and I've had relatives in Israel Palestine starting in 1904. And I'm sure going way back before then too. But I was just educated on stories of the Holocaust, and that was terrifying. And so the idea of the irrational taking over people's minds and making them believe ridiculous conspiracy theories, and then being able to go even further to dehumanize people and then mass murder them and genocide, that was terrifying. And trying to come to grips with what is the solution to that? How do we help? It felt like it was psychological. I mean, humanity as a whole, even however 7.5 or almost 8 billion of us, we can all have good lives. There's enough resources on this planet if it was fairly distributed, and if they were wisely used. So it's not a matter of resource constraints. It's a matter of psychological factors. So this idea of the Holocaust really got me focused on what can we do to spiritualize people, to bring out their shadows, to help them work with it so they don't project them on others. And it was the fear of the Holocaust occurring again which, we've seen genocide in Rwanda. We've seen a lot of genocide since then. It's not just to the Jews. So it felt like the sense of connection, the sense of spiritual, that we're all one, that we are all united, connected, and that if you feel that, it's different than just saying that. But if you felt it, experienced it, then you're going to be less prejudiced and less willing to demonize others, less willing to kill them, and also more protective of the earth. So, and I have had a dream that was in my 20s of a Holocaust survivor telling me that he was miraculously saved from murder. I mean, a bunch of people were gunned down, buried alive, and he was one of them, or most of them were dead. But in any case, he survived, and he knew he was survived for a purpose, but he didn't know what the purpose was. And in the dream, he's telling me on his deathbed, he's saying, the purpose was for me to tell you to be a psychedelic therapist. So I felt this whole time I've been driven by fear, but fear that's not overwhelming, but that's been there ever present. And that has been what's enabled me to take such a long-term perspective. It's now 48 years since I decided to do this, since I was 18 in 1972. And, no matter what the DEA would do, or blocking, or all these exaggerated things about MDMA neurotoxicity or whatever, none of them were as bad as the alternative of just letting humanity not get access to these tools that can be so potentially healing when used wisely. So I'd say being Jewish was kind of the essential piece of the motivation for me to be working on psychedelics.
Cool. I'm going to ask one last question, and then going to ask some of the many questions that have been collecting from our listeners. And for the final question, because so many folks listening in, I know, are therapists, can you speak just a bit about the qualifications needed to become an MDMA therapist? And will these requirements be the same across all psychedelic therapies? Like, are you coordinating with Compass and Heffter to determine those requirements?
Well, they're all going to be determined by the FDA. So we are sharing information among the different sponsors about what FDA is requiring. And it's not resolved yet. So in our negotiations for phase 3, which is sort of locked, you could say, through this agreement letter and the special protocol assessment process, FDA agreed that we work with a 2-person team. We think it's more effective. We think it's safer. We don't think it's twice as good, but we think most underground psychedelic therapists are single therapists with patients. Most therapists are 1 person, but we have a 2-person model. We'd like to keep that. And the first person FDA agreed on is a master's. Somebody has to have a license to do therapy. The second person can be a student that doesn't have a license. They want him to have him or her to have a bachelor's degree. We don't think that's necessary either. We don't think they need to be in a program to get a license to become a therapist. Then Compass and USONA came along with psilocybin, and FDA got a little bit more concerned, and they tightened it up. And they wanted to say that the lead person needs to be an MD PhD. And Compass and USONA agreed to that for a while to get their things moving forward. So then what we did was we challenged that. FDA started trying to impose that on us, on our new studies. So in our study that we're trying to do at the Bronx VA, we said, look, this is the exact same patient population, PTSD patients that you've let us have master's level be the lead person, and that the second person could be a student. There's no reason for an MD PhD. We had 22 letters from a bunch of great people about how requiring MD PhD is a complete misunderstanding. FDA has never really regulated psychotherapy. Anyway, they don't understand. It just look good to them. MD PhD, it's higher level. But MDs don't really know necessarily about psychotherapy. Even psychiatrists often don't know about psychotherapy. PhDs know a lot about research. So the FDA basically semi-conceded. They said that there needs to be a doctor in the building, but if there's a doctor in the building, then the lead person can be a master's level and the second person can be a student. So we don't believe that there needs to be a doctor in the building. There needs to be a doctor that does the medical screening and is on call But we know the risks of MDMA. We know the risks of psilocybin. So we're engaged in a formal dispute resolution process. Because this is so crucial, the credentials of the therapists, we've hired incredible lawyers. This is one of the best Washington, D.C. legal firms that has a specialty in arguing with the FDA. And so it's probably going to cost us $200,000 in legal fees to argue this out. But luckily, we have the phase 3 data where some of our people have PhDs on the team, some of them don't. And some of them have doctors on site, and some of them have doctors on call. And we don't see a difference in safety or efficacy between the two groups. So I think our case is going to get stronger and stronger. So the training that we want people to have would be, we do believe that somebody should be a psychotherapist. On the other hand, when we talk about drug policy reform and access, the Zendo training, the psychedelic harm reduction training, we don't say people have to have licenses. We want to get peer support. We want to train people to help themselves, help their friends. And I think a lot of good can be done that way. But in a medical situation where we want it to be insurance coverage, we think there will be some necessity for formal licenses. The second person, I'll just say, we'd like to be a music therapist or a massage therapist, or if they want to. Why do they need to have a bachelor's degree? It's a ridiculous thing. And also, why do they need to be a student in a psychotherapy program if the main person is the therapist and they're working under supervision of the other person?
Cool. I'm going to move to some of our questions from the listeners that honestly overlap a lot with some of the questions I hadn't even gotten to, which I'm happy to see. I'm especially happy that the question with by far the most votes is the following. We have concern about communities of color who have disproportionately been incarcerated for substances. That we have concerns that they will be left behind in this mainstreaming. In Oregon's Prop 109, the psilocybin initiative dropped defelonization in favor of going the medicalization route. What policies do MAPS and other leading groups have in place to not prioritize safety for middle-class white people over groups that experience more government harm from interacting with psychedelics? I might say a quick word before letting you answer on that, which, I have a lot to say, but the quick word that I will just want to shout out to you is that there's also a prop in Oregon 110 that decriminalizes all substances. So I'll just say it is of the utmost importance, according to the policy team at MAPS, that this decriminalization bill is passed in conjunction with Prop 109. And yeah, Rick, I'll let you start to answer the rest about how we can ensure that people of color who have been disproportionately impacted by incarceration and the war on drugs are included in our work moving forward.
Yeah, well, mostly it's thanks to you and a few others for really highlighting the need to do that, and then getting some funding from the Open Society Foundation, from George Soros, from Dr. Bronner's, from the Psychedelic Science Funding Collaborative, from River Styx, from the Libra Foundation, from the Pritzkers, which is for human rights. And so I'd say there was a certain blindness on my part in that in phase 2, particularly when we were reaching out, we did one study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. I just assumed that a lot of veterans, well, I know a lot of veterans, 40% of veterans are minorities, and I just assumed that a lot of them would volunteer for the study. And it didn't happen. And so, so I was really wrong about that. And when we started looking at that, we started having this idea that we need to train therapists of color, and that patients of color, BIPOC patients, will be more willing to come to therapists who look like themselves than they will. Now, it's not exclusively true. We have had a little bit better representation now in phase 3. But maybe, Natalie, you can describe a little bit the training for therapists of color that you helped create.
Sure. And also I'll say a word that in realizing how we had fewer folks of color applying to be in our studies than we might have expected, it was really important to recognize the horrible history of medical experimentation and research on Black Americans in particular, and that there's a lot of really grounded in history, a lot of fears associated with, experimentations in this way. So as Rick mentioned, we organized a training focused on communities of color and kind of broader cultural components of psychedelic medicine last August. And I'm really excited to announce that we are going to be more formally announcing soon a formal commitment to health equity that involves a sum of money that we are going to be continuing to raise to ensure that therapists can participate in our training if cost is a barrier. It's also going to provide access for patients for the same thing. For expanded access, patients will have to pay, so it will also provide funding for that. And most excitingly for me to have this ongoing work supported, it also includes hiring some more staff at MAPS fully focused on health equity. So honestly, I can't speak, unfortunately, for other psychedelic groups in the space, and I do think it's a big a gap or something that there's a lot of room for improvement around. But I'm excited to say that stuff is changing, and it's really, I think, important to acknowledge when we talk about psychedelic medicine, psychedelics and plant medicine come from indigenous cultures around the world that are mostly what we would now call communities of color. So there is also this idea that psychedelics are this white kind of thing, but I think that really needs to be examined a bit more. And I see the second question that got the most votes here is about our plan, MAPS, about our plans to scale up training for MDMA therapists to meet the demand. And I'll let Rick speak more to that, but I just want to kind of reiterate that we have a plan and a commitment to ensure that as we're expanding our therapist training, that therapists from all different marginalized backgrounds, and this question was about communities of color, but we're also considering all communities who are marginalized by the mental health care system in general, to make sure that they're included in our therapist pool, so that by FDA approval, they will also be able to reach the communities that we might not have reached yet. But yeah, Rick, if you can speak a bit more about our plans for scaling up therapist training, and also maybe how COVID has impacted that, because I know that it's helped decrease costs moving online and things like that. So it might be interesting to touch on that.
Yes. I also, though, just want to mention that the Eleusinian mysteries from 1600 BC to 396 AD, the longest running mystery ceremonies in the world, that was had a psychedelic drink, Kikion, came from the Greek culture. So while you're pointing to indigenous cultures, and that's very true, where ayahuasca comes from, iboga, mushroom.
It's Greek, right? If there are people living on that land, I mean.
Yeah, but I just think that all cultures, I'm trying to just say, have part of the historical contributions to the psychedelic movement.
Definitely.
And there's also an interesting book, The Immortality Key, that's about the role of psychedelics in the Eleusinian mysteries, but also in early Christianity, that's going to be coming out soon, which I think is really going to be interesting for people. So I think, and also MDMA, I'm so glad in some ways that MDMA and LSD don't come from nature, because in a way, we although LSA, lysergic acid amide, comes from morning glory seeds. So, but with MDMA, it doesn't appear in nature. And so we can kind of create our own contexts, and we need to honor the past. So as a Reformed Jew, it's our obligation to take the traditions of the past and make them our own in modern times, and not be a slave to tradition like the Orthodox are. So anyway, about training more therapists. I think the key to scaling is training more therapists. And we are very, the big struggle and the big cost is whether therapists should have their own experiences with the drugs that they're wanting to give to their patients. And so we do have approval from the FDA for 120 people to receive MDMA in a protocol where it's limited to people in our therapist training program. And I think that has been a big factor contributing to the success of our phase 2 and phase 3 studies. But it's expensive to do. And because, it's a bit different with psilocybin. Therapists with psilocybin can go to the Netherlands and legally get it, or go to Jamaica, or do some things where we don't have any legal context for people to take MDMA unless it's in a protocol, which then adds a bunch of, expenses to it. We don't think that we should require every therapist to do MDMA, but we think that there should be an option for them to volunteer if they want to. So that's what we're struggling with. And we are working with researchers in the Netherlands, in Israel, in England, and in the Czech Republic who are working on trying to get protocols approved to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. The psilocybin companies don't think it's necessary for their people to have psilocybin. And so what we're doing is we're trying, there's going to be exponential growth in the training of therapists. But we want to, as I said before, when you roll out something earlier, new that's controversial, you want it to be safer and well done. You don't want to rush it out. So what we're requiring is that we only have 7 trainers right now to train other people. We have different levels of supervisors, of adherence raters, all these steps. And the final step of training therapists is to have them work with PTSD patients under supervision. And that can only happen in a protocol. So we're very limited by the number of patients that are therapists that we can train now, fully trained. And we are exploring breath work or ketamine or other things that could be done instead of MDMA while we're still trying to sort through the MDMA situation. But post-approval, when MDMA is a prescription medicine, there'll be a lot more opportunities to train a lot more therapists because we'll be able to supervise them in real context. Expanded access, which is compassionate use. We have 15 phase 3 sites, 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, and 11 throughout the United States. Phase 3, we're going to have 1 last site in Canada, but the rest are going on. And we've got approval for about 10 more sites in the United States for compassionate use. And also in Israel, 50 patients have been approved and 5 more sites there. So we are training people. But what I saw yesterday, we made a presentation to some of our capstone donors. And the prediction of our therapy training team is by 2030, we'll have 20,000 fully trained therapists. So that's going to be really, that's our challenge. And the other part of it, though, to say is that, there's 8 million PTSD patients in the United States. So even 20,000 therapists are not nearly enough. So a big thing that we're trying to look at, not quite yet, but soon, is going to be group therapy. I think that could be a big breakthrough for access. But it will require even better trained therapists. Well, not better trained therapists, but if you're trying to manage a bunch of different people, it can be more challenging. So I think the group therapy model is something we need to explore.
Totally. And along those lines, I see Bia said in the chat, just because MDMA and LSD are not directly used by Indigenous people, it doesn't mean that the community isn't still, indebted to them. But along the lines of group therapy, certainly medicines have been used in group contexts for thousands of years. So I look forward to learning from all that wisdom and integrating it into our, modern Western medical context.
I totally agree with Bia. Sorry if I gave that impression, but I think that in these Indigenous group contexts, the kind of integration work happens by the community because they're all involved in this. And that's what we don't have in our own context, that we can have group therapy, but then people disperse. And where's the integration? Whereas before it was happening, just by the entire community, knowing what's going on and supporting people.
Totally. And something I feel called to share on that note is I've talked to so many people who've traveled, to South America to sit in ceremony and have had really powerful experience, but then they leave and don't have that community and ongoing support. And sometimes they're not able to integrate as successfully as they would be otherwise. So I do really think that community integration, having that ongoing, is a really key element of healing, especially when we're healing traumas on a more cultural or community level. I'm going to read our next question because, happy 420 if you're on the East Coast and we're wrapping up. So I'm going to read just our last few questions here. Many of our neighbors, friends, coworkers, and peers are supporters of psychedelic medicine, but they have to stay silent out of fear of damaging their jobs or careers. And I'll add even losing your ability to be a parent that can be impacted if you talk about drugs sometimes. What can the people in this chat help destigmatizing support of psychedelic medicine and research by average people? I think what can we do to help destigmatize psychedelics more and more? And what are ways maybe that average person might feel more safe speaking about this stuff?
Well, those people that have privilege or resources or can take the risk, the reputational risk, need to lead the way. So I think we need a vast coming out of the psychedelic community in public. And the same way that we saw in the gay rights and gay marriage, that was really facilitated by people coming out. And the people that come out earlier are the ones that take a bigger risk. And so, I can understand people to be careful about their own particular risks. So I would say that for each one of us, if you think you could survive a backlash, if you could survive the reputational risk, then it's more incumbent upon you than the people that are more vulnerable to come out. You could come out in safer ways to your family, to your grandparents, to your relatives, eventually at work or in your other communities that you belong to. But I do think that we need this coming out, and everybody has to discuss for themselves and decide for themselves when the point comes that they can take that risk. The other thing is, again, this idea of supporting the research or learning about the research, even because the research is something that everybody can point to and defend without putting yourself at that much risk. Like, I've read Michael Pollan's book. I've read these scientific papers. This seems to be important. This seems to be working for a lot of people. And so you can come out in different ways without acknowledging your own personal use. And so I just think all of us, we should look for ways that we can influence the sort of change in consciousness of, the mass of humanity, and don't think that it's not important if it's just one or two people that you do it to. I think that's going to be very, very important.
I want to reiterate that last point, that nothing is too small. Like, having a meaningful conversation with one person that you feel safe with really can make a big difference. So if you're not comfortable speaking more publicly about it, that's like one end of the spectrum. There's really so much to do before that, whether it's sharing research, sharing articles, asking questions, asking an innocent question like, have you seen this study? That's so interesting. I think that is really helpful. But I also, Rick, appreciate you acknowledging the privilege that comes with the safety and ability to speak publicly about these medicines. And that is definitely not the same for everyone. Okay, so we're wrapping up here. This is sorry, yeah?
I was just going to say, when I was 18, I, sort of came out to my parents and said, I'm dropping out of college. I want to study LSD. I want you to pay for it. And eventually they said yes. So I've always had that parental support. So that's been a big part. And so I've had it easier than I think most people. But those with privilege need to use that privilege on behalf of the whole community.
I certainly agree with that. This question is a very important one, I think. What are steps being taken in order to have health insurance covered for MDMA treatment?
we've worked with Elliot Marseille, who's a healthcare economist, and he's got now a paper that's being reviewed by Plus One that looks at the cost effectiveness. So insurance companies want to see cost effectiveness, and in particular, what they want to see is long-term follow-ups, because this work is more labor intensive. It's more expensive than just having somebody come to a psychotherapy for, 1 hour a week for, a year or several months, or more expensive than just giving somebody pills for a short period of time. So what we got to do is the research to demonstrate the durability of the effects, the magnitude and durability of the effects. But we are now starting what we call our very long-term follow-up study to a lot of the people in phase 2, some of whom will have been treated over 15 years ago. And we're trying to look at all of their medical records as well, because if we can show that, well, it's already clear that people that have PTSD use healthcare more than others. They're living in such stress. They get other diseases. They get panic reactions. They go to emergency rooms. They cost a lot of money. And so in addition to just helping them through PTSD, we're trying to gather information about healthcare utilization costs. And so Elliot and I had a conversation the other day, and he says he thinks the data will show, or does show, that it will be cost savings. And so it's about our ability to persuasively gather that data, subject it to peer review, and share it with insurance companies so that they will see that it's a worthwhile expense. So I think that's a big part of going forward is what happens if we get it approved and it's only for self-pay people. That's something, but it's not enough.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, we are really committed to doing all that we can to ensure health insurance coverage, because we know that's key for access. And just as more along those lines, Rick has been dedicated to doing cannabis research for a long time to ensure that we can also receive insurance coverage if we do federal cannabis approval, because right now it's only legal state by state and insurance cannot cover it. So that is definitely a core value of MAP's work. I see this other question, which is, how do we ensure that the same level of transparency exists for all other for-profit companies in the field? And how do we hold these for-profit companies accountable for not exploiting the public?
Well, first off, we have limited power to do that. So our best thing is power by example. We need to demonstrate transparency, demonstrate accountability, demonstrate health equity, and then have the public try to call everybody to account. You can't force people in for-profit companies. Like how much can we force pharma companies? Only recently, pharma companies, you have to get 2 phase 3 studies. Statistically significant, sufficient safety to get a drug approved as a medicine. In the past, pharmaceutical companies sometimes did 5 or 6 studies or more just to get 2 that worked. And you'd never hear about the ones that didn't work. So Congress actually now passed some laws, clinicaltrials.gov. You have to post your protocol that you're about to do so that these missing failed studies don't just disappear and you only hear about the 2 that worked. So I think it's really by example that what we need to do is demonstrate best practices as we understand them to be, and then have people call other companies to account. Or other companies may also be wanting to do that. You see more and more companies are talking about trying to go carbon neutral. Now a lot of companies didn't start that, but you build public support, public pressure like that, and then I think that we'll see it more widespread.
Cool. I think that's it. We're supposed to wrap it up at 4:30. So I don't know, Rick, if there's anything else you want to say in closing.
Just that I appreciate the opportunity that Chacruna gave us to have this conversation. I appreciate responding to difficult questions. And I would just encourage people to think that our big challenge, probably starting in November, is to raise a bunch more money to take MDMA to Europe. So if people happen to know philanthropists in Europe that want to donate, and the countries that we're going to be involved in are Germany, Finland, Norway, Portugal, England, the Netherlands and the Czech Republic, and we have relationships with a lot of charitable organizations in many of those countries. So that's what we need the most help with.
Well, thank you all for these really great questions. I'm really encouraged to see what you're all thinking about, and definitely keep reaching out, and I'd be happy to share more resources through Bia and Chacruna or on our MAPS site or social media about a lot of the different things we talked about. And thank you. And thank you, Rick. This was really fun. Nice to meet you. And thank you, Bia and Chacruna. Josh.
Thank you so much, Rick and Natalie. Just deep gratitude for both of you and the amazing work that you're doing. Really leading the way as a light for psychedelic renaissance. So thank you for joining us today. With that, I'm going to say goodbye to both of you and just close with a few quick announcements. Thank you all so much for coming. I just want to reiterate that the recording of this event will be available as soon as we close. So if you missed anything or want to go back and watch any of it, that's available right after we're done, right here on the same page. And I just want to announce a couple more events we have coming up. We have community forums now every Wednesday for the next few months, which has been really great. They're all very different and unique, but same time, same place. And so next week we have one called Ayahuasca Singing, Indigenous Knowledge and Decolonization. And that is, I'm gonna just post the link for that. 1 second. And I'm blanking on the name of that speaker right now. Bern Brabeck Demori, who is an anthropologist and ethnomusicologist who has studied ayahuasca singing and song in indigenous communities, and is exploring kind of how the singing has evolved and changed as ayahuasca has become more globalized and more Westerners have been coming to the Amazon to use it, and how that relates to issues of globalization and colonization. So it should be really interesting, very different than today's event. Definitely check that out. Post the link right now. And then the following week will be on September 30th. We have a really interesting event that we just announced. That's featuring actually Ismail Ali, who is another, along with Natalie, the director, or I don't remember his exact role, but a policy and advocacy lawyer for MAPS. And he is going to be joined by Tessa Levine and Maria Mangini and Adele Getty. And it's going to be an event exploring generation gaps and kind of the gaps of understanding and conversation around and awareness around different social cultural issues related to psychedelics, and how that's different for sort of the elders from the 60s and the first wave or the second wave of psychedelics then, and then the younger millennials and Gen Xers from the grew up with this third wave. So that should be a very interesting conversation, and we just posted the Crowdcast event for that, so I'm going to post that one as well. It's called Bridging the Generation Gap in the Psychedelic Community. And if you want to keep coming to these events and you want discounts and you like these events and want to support Chacruna and just become more of part of the community and the inner circle, then I highly encourage you to become a member. So you'll notice a big bluish button at the bottom of the screen that will take you to our Patreon page. And we have several different tiers of membership, and we're doing all kinds of, so you get discounts to all our events, and also, or free depending on the tier, and also access to our Discord online server and access to special member-only webinars. So we have one of those coming up next week. We're going to do an AMA, Ask Me Anything, on the Discord for all the members this Friday with Bia. So lots of great stuff there, and more in the works. And some of the membership tiers also include one of these free new T-shirts, which we just got made, which are really, really awesome. protect and honor sacred plants. I'm also going to just post the link if you want to buy a t-shirt. We have those for sale as well. And finally, all the recordings from our previous community forums are available for rewatching, and for $5 each. And you can check those all out on our Crowdcast page if you want to see any of the past events that we've done. So posting the link for that. And I think that is all I have for today. I want to thank everyone once again for joining us. Thank you to Rick and Natalie and everyone at MAPS for the incredible work that you're doing. And we hope to see you all again very soon. Stay safe.